coming up on Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast.
The long short of it is, for you to recover from trauma or start to heal, you have to connect to safety and nourishment. If you try to do nervous system work without knowing what safety is or being able to access it, it's potentially re-traumatizing.
Hey y'all, it's Helen and you're listening to Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast. A great day to release a podcast episode because I just had an amazing conversation with Somatic coach Jennie Tian. We dive deep into what somatics are, what trauma-informed care is, and Jennie has had extensive experience personally and professionally coaching and healing people in a leadership and trauma-related capacity. We talk about how trauma involves giving people choice and support for clients to help reconnect to their own bodies. Jennie also talks about her coaching process where she helps clients tune into their body signals, and she even does some on me if you're interested in that. So if you're ready to explore the power of somatics and trauma-informed care, be sure to check out this full episode of Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. And thanks for tuning in. So Jennie Tian, welcome to Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast. You sat with me through probably 10 minutes of having audio difficulties. We're just improvising today, but it's nice to just have my hands free and to be able to just talk to you like we're having coffee or something. It is currently 8:40 in the morning in Los Angeles. What time is it over there in Michigan?
It is 11:41 a.m.
Would you say you're not a morning person?
Yeah, I'm not. I think I can be. I don't think I've ever been actually a morning person, but I've had to wake up early for I remember in high school, there were classes that started at 7. I did go to those, but those days are long gone.
Those days are long gone. I'm no longer a student, okay?
Yeah, and also, I guess I could, but All
right, we're going to start with some icebreaker questions. I want to do some rapid fire 12 questions just to warm us up a little bit, get us started in the morning. But are you ready?
Yeah, do it.
Okay. Favorite ramen?
Oh, well, I think it depends. Oh my God, my app. One sign I should have latched onto for ADHD is my appetite is so really depends on the moment, but either it depends, but either the traditional pork one or the spicy one with the black garlic sauce.
Yeah, I'm more basic. I usually go chicken python or something. It's my coffee brand. Yeah. Anyway, if you were to star in a reality TV show, which one would you do?
The one I want to do is by no means healthy for me. I am so curious what it would be like to be on, two shows. I would love to be on Love is Blind because it's just, that show is wild. And after learning, the synopsis is actually interesting. Just being able to listen to someone and have a conversation with someone, I feel like it would be objectively, it sounds really great. But I feel like the physical, I don't know if you believe this, but the physical really matters because you have to be attracted to someone. Totally.
But I don't know. What do you think? I interrupted you there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's at least worth the way that they set, I could go on for hours about this, but the way that they set up that show is very good for reality television, as in it's a super interesting premises and they keep calling it an experiment. And I'm okay, fair enough. You're essentially testing the variable of what happens when you don't get to see someone, but you really get to know someone first. So I think it does a good job in emphasizing the importance of non-physical attraction, but I think physical is part of it. And I feel like you have seen couples fall apart on that after they get to teeth. So it's the importance of the physical piece will depend on, we should probably de-emphasize that based on how culture emphasizes it, but it's there. Yeah.
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Also I was reading about the, and by reading, watching TikToks, about the, what's it called? The show's conditions that they put the contestants through. And long story short, it's super traumatic. You sleep 4 hours a day when you're on that thing. And there's a whole league, a few of the contestants are getting together right now to basically sue them or have some kind of legal action against them because it's like bad. They don't really feed them and they make them not sleep to basically mine out they're essentially like to increase the level that increase their stress level so they would be more dramatic on television. It's like it's actually capitalizing on their stress and trauma. So it's crazy. Like it makes like I hesitate to say it makes sense, but if I'm putting on like my Netflix hat and I'm like, if my only goal is to make money, I'm like, yeah, sure. At what cost?
That makes so much sense. I came across like this clip on YouTube Shorts about why we sleep. And it was like an interview Joe Rogan was doing with, I believe his name is Matthew Walker. And he was doing an interview and Joe Rogan was like, what happens to your body when you sleep 8 hours one day, 8 hours the next day, like 7 hours, maybe 4 hours the next day, and then 8 hours the following day. Like you're still getting a good chunk of 8 hours. And Matthew Walker was like, your body actually loses some of its anti-cancer cells the less you sleep. And so you're far more likely to develop cancer than you are without any sleep. And I think that one of the symptoms that I always make sure clients, granted this isn't medical advice, but one of the symptoms I always like to ask clients is, are you sleeping? Because if you're not sleeping, your body doesn't regulate at a good enough rate. And then it ends up getting depressed, it gets more anxious. And so it explains some of the physical reactions that some of those contestants were experiencing.
Yeah. And apparently they don't really let them see the outside. There's no sunlight. Yeah, because somebody said that they were basically the only time you get to go outside, because the studio enclosure has no windows. The only time you get to be outside is to go to the bathroom.
Oh my gosh.
And they're in there for 21 days or something. I don't know, 14, whatever the number is. But it's like a long time. So they said the experience was literally losing touch with reality. Which I'm just like, how did this exist? How is this allowed?
That's crazy to me. Wow. Anyways.
Why would I be on that show? But yeah, it's an interesting
now that we're talking.
Yeah.
Anyway, I feel like this question moves into some of the work that you do as a somatic coach.
Yeah.
And maybe we can transition a little bit, because I feel like I would be a bad interviewer if I didn't ask you. Just knowing you, Jennie, we've had 2 or 3 separate conversations outside of this. And you're really passionate about something called somatic healing and trauma-informed coaching. Can you define the terms for me of what those things even are?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say somatics, just like somatic anything, anytime you hear that word, what it's really referring to is just like having to do with the body. Because I believe soma is like Latin or Greek, whatever ancient language I'm forgetting right now. The root word is soma, which is the body. The root word is which is the body. And then, so that's also why when you hear somatics, whether it's coaching, therapy, a different modality, it can be really vague. Because it basically just says you're working physically in some way, but it doesn't really define depth or et cetera, or how really. So that's what like somatics means to me. In terms of trauma informed or aware, I think it's a bit more complicated because there's a set of principles for what trauma informed or aware care is that I think people have some, I don't want to say it's debate, but just I think it's a general set of like guidelines, but I've seen very few people like explicitly define it. But the best, like when I think of trauma awareness, I think of the care or interaction as being agency providing for both people, but especially if it's a practitioner-client relationship, the agency, like the job of the practitioner is to help support the client in reacquainting with their agency. And then it's also, which along with that comes with the idea of choice. So it's like expanding choice. And you typically use things like open, inviting language, et cetera, et cetera. And I think I'm missing something, but basically it's, if you're a client and you don't feel comfortable in a trauma-aware space, it's more likely than not that the space wasn't designed well. For example, if you're someone who has experienced trauma, I would trust, if I were a client, I would just check in with yourself or anybody, because so what I've seen is that a lot of trauma aware, both somatics and trauma awareness have become very popular, very trendy, which is great because it spreads awareness. And this has happened in the last few years, but I haven't seen a lot of trauma aware spaces being designed that. I think
trauma aware spaces. Can you describe what a trauma aware space might look like?
Yeah, I think I've heard people use terms like the terms trauma aware and trauma informed interchangeably. So I do as well. But basically, it's a space in which if an individual has experienced any kind of trauma or traumatic symptoms, etc., they can go in that space and feel safe.
They can go into the space and feel safe. So is that more of a subjective understanding for the client? Like the client has to feel like they feel safe. And so how do they know that a place is a trauma-informed space?
Yeah. So I would say so. In my ideal world, I'm people who experience spaces get to define whether they feel safe in it and therefore whether it's designed well enough for them. Because also I'm if you're designing a trauma-aware space, for example, I'm if I'm holding a group workshop or something and I say it's trauma-aware, but then people walk away feeling trauma or unsafe, I didn't do it. I can't just then argue and say this was trauma aware. That doesn't that's against the whole principle of trauma awareness.
But I would also argue too, for the populations that we serve for Asian Americans, we're taught to be very agreeable. And so I would argue too that for someone that's just entering a group workshop or entering therapy for the first time, most Asian Americans don't have any experience with past therapies. And so they think it's supposed to be painful. And so when you say that a trauma-informed space is supposed to make you feel safe after, that's new for a lot of people listening. And so why is it important to feel safety when you're processing trauma?
This is such a big question.
I just gave you something that's so easy to make a home run.
Yeah, because there's two immediate thoughts that are related that came up, but in no particular order. To directly answer your question, why is safety important in trauma work? From a nervous system perspective, it's actually critical because the long short of it is for you to recover from trauma or start to heal, you have to connect to safety and nourishment. It's very hard to, at least for nervous system regulation, to heal or do that without having something to anchor in. If you try to do nervous system work without knowing what safety is or being able to access it, it's potentially re-traumatizing. So that's why for people for some clients who have, who basically are experiencing a time where it's super difficult and it's just, there's not really much room to maneuver or expand. I think it's I think the better course of action is to just help them cope in the moment and don't worry about nervous system work. Just get to the next island where you can find some safety, and then we could do whatever. But so in context, for example, when I'm thinking of nervous system regulation, let's just say part of it is release work that I'm recommending people. I would not recommend that for someone who has no semblance of safety in their life, because once it comes up, it's hard to
Jennie,
force box because you could ground and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And orient. I wouldn't poke at your trauma in hopes of resolving it without knowing you can safely do. That's awful.
I could put that on a banner. I would not recommend trauma work for someone that doesn't have any semblance of safety in their lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for
that's so good. But you said that. I'm just literally taking what you said and I plastered it on my brain. And I'm okay.
Yeah.
And as a therapist, I think that I do have that knowledge, but the people listening might not have. And so for someone interested in doing their healing work and they don't have a sense of, quote, safety, I also want to unpack what safety looks like. It's like being able to regulate your nervous system, having a safe space of people to talk to, having a safe home to come home to, not being yelled at on all the time. Obviously, if you are being abused, seek help immediately. But can you unpack, like if a client comes to you and says, Jennie, I want to start doing somatic healing work, and you start to do an assessment, what are markers that you look for to indicate that a person is like regulated and able to have a sense of safety?
Yeah. Oh, so such a complicated question. But yeah, so the thing I'm latching onto is the word regulated. So most people that come to me are not necessarily are experiencing a period of dysregulation. So I'm the one that helps support them on the journey to regulation. So I don't see a lot of regulation in the moment. But in terms of if you're looking at it in a longer scale, what I do look for is a safe environment. Basically, I ask them. So it's a couple of things. I ask my assessment, so to speak, is I ask them about like how safe their life is in various ways. And then I also watch. So I do both video and audio calls. So whatever data input I have, whether it's through the voice or in video, I watch for basically signs in the course of the conversation. Are there moments where they seem relatively grounded and calm and whatever semblance of safety looks like? Yeah, like,
do you notice that in their voice? Do you notice that in their way they talk to you? Like the pace? What are some of the key indicators if you're doing like a phone call or even an audio, like a video call that you look for?
Yeah, so I would say like video, you could do a lot with voice. But there's some things you can't that can only be done with video. And those are the things where basically you can't tell by voice alone. Because, well, when we get deeper into, so backtracking, I'm being trained in a modality called somatic experiencing. So somatic experiencing is like a very visual modality where it's a very physical one. And a big part of the work is just like the practitioner watching the client's body do things that they may or may not be aware of and playing it back to them to ask, is this something? So for example, if we were working together, and this, I'm sure this is different per practitioner.
Sure.
For me, 80% of my energy goes towards just like staring at you in the sense of, for example, I'll ask if we're doing like a tracking sensation exercise and you're like tuning in with your body. And for example, you're like closing your eyes and all of a sudden I see like your hands like twitch or like you do this or just something happens, right? I'll log it. And then if I feel like it's relevant, I'll play it back to you to be like, hey, was that something? Like, did you notice that? Anything? And so when I've been a client of this in training, where like I was being asked to track and whatnot, there were things that like it baffled me what people played back to me. So one of my really good friends in the program, they like we were connecting with a lot of like my grief in this exercise. And one of the things, actually, this completely changed my life in March, but they basically said after the exercise that, by the way, when they were telling me to we're playing with taking breaths, basically, where to as a form of support. But they were saying that like when I was taking a breath, basically when I was inhaling, I wasn't really taking in that much air. But when I was exhaling, I like let out a whole bunch such that like my entire body collapsed, which like blew my mind because I consider myself to be very body aware and I had no real awareness of that. But what that then meant was, and so when they played it back to me, I was like, oh, that makes sense because just in a broader sense, at that time of my life and physically in the moment as we were doing the exercise, basically I just wasn't resourced enough or supported enough. As in every time they asked me to take in air, I was like, But every time I let out, it just wasn't me.
It's so simple. It's like someone being there to really see you and see what you're acting in and noticing those nonverbal cues.
Lie, apparently.
The body
like it has to mean something. Well, like it's worth exploring.
Can you unpack that Can you unpack that statement for me? Not everything has to mean something, but it's worth exploring. Like, how do you know that something isn't really meaningful, not to push a client or when something actually doesn't mean anything? How do you clock that?
I just ask them because I don't.
Okay.
And if they don't think it means anything, and let's say it does, that's fine. It'll probably come up again another way later. Mm-hmm. So so I would always, and I think that's part of the trauma awareness framework where, I think part of trauma awareness is like, especially for bottom up modalities like somatic work or somatic experiencing, it doesn't make sense to me that my expertise would override someone's understanding experience
of their own body. Yeah. For people listening, bottom up is being able to understand the external and then go internal slowly. Okay.
Yeah. Because bottom up's basically working with like sensory stuff inside, outside. It's like when I think of the difference between bottom up and top down is bottom up is working with your body to sense your internal and external environment. And from that, just like a pile of data, then make sense of that information if there is any sense to be made of. But then top down, the modalities like CBT is where you're working with the brain to form narrative arcs to then interpret your experience. So it's, you think about the thing, you make meaning up here, and then you're like, I decide that this is what the experience is. But sometimes we could do this, like we could have X meaning come up in our mind, but it's not actually what our sensory experience is. So that's where you get into, for example, if you spend for me, the case was I spent on and off about 10 years in like CBT based talk therapy. And it got to a point where it just felt it was less and less effective. And I didn't know why. But then later on, after being spontaneously introduced to like somatics and nervous system work, I realized I never took into account my actual experience.
Interesting.
But I was like, oh, obviously, like basically I was just like, I want my life to mean this, and therefore it means this. And apply that to experiences, but like that wasn't actually real.
Whoa.
And based on my developmental history, it makes a lot of sense. Because I think I've experienced a lot of just needing to override my own reality for other people.
Whoa, Jennie.
This was easy. But like Jennie, I was anxious.
Let's rewind a sec, because I feel like there's a lot in what you just said there that I want to unpack. The first thing I want to talk about is, and the limitations it had for you, because I don't want to take away from folks who might be in CBT and find it effective.
It is.
But I want you to talk about it specific to your own developmental history, because you tied in the need to override your experiences through logic. And so unpack that for me. I'd love to hear more. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the simplest way to talk about it is basically I grew up in a family, at least with my parents' level, that really emphasized logic over feeling. They just like feelings were really de-emphasized to the point
you come
where
from a Chinese family, right?
Yeah, I'm Chinese. Like I was born in China, moved to US when I was young. Okay. But yeah, like Chinese Americans, how I identify. Yeah, they just like really didn't care about feelings. And it's not necessarily like, the more I've done my own work and like especially explored my own neurodivergence, like start to realize, oh, I think neurodivergence shows up in these ways in my family, but I'm not sure that I don't think they'll ever admit it. I don't know that they're open to exploring it, et cetera, et cetera. But I think part of how my family has experienced neurodivergence as well as trauma is just feelings don't make sense to them. And
makes so because it's very like for folks listening, there's a lot of terms we're throwing out today because Jennie is so smart and so informed. And
so please ask.
Yeah, I think that for people who identify as neurodivergent, they're extremely logic driven, and it's hard to pick up on social cues and subtle nuances when it comes to the emotional brain. And
It
so
can be.
people, yeah, unpack that for what it looks like in your family, because I don't want to speak for you.
Like neurodivergence is, and I'm by no means an expert on neurodivergence, because I started exploring it as a part of trying to understand my own. But like my long short of it for neurodivergence is it's divergence. That's the basis of it. So it can look a whole bunch of different ways, often contradictory ways, but it's still all symptoms. These can all still be symptoms of the same type of diagnosis or whatever you call it.
Like when you think about neurotypical brain versus neurodivergent brain, neurodivergent usually talks about autism, ADHD, like brain patterns that don't necessarily coincide with the quote rest of society. But it's important to not look at it from like a black and white or like binary standpoint, where it's like, for similar to what you said, Jennie, it's like a spectrum of like different ways of thinking or different like modes of thinking, right?
Yeah, so I'm reading this amazing book that came highly recommended by most people I talked to about this. And it's called Unmasking Autism by Devin Price. And basically in it, so Dr. Price talks about how, what is it? Exactly what you said. So they talk about how neurotypicality or neurotypicalness isn't real. It's an ideal, but it's not necessarily an unattainable one. So everyone is some sort of neurodivergent, but some of us are closer to that than others. So we all totally sit on this spectrum or what have you.
Interesting. So there's like definitely different layers of how feelings were overridden in your family because of the neurodivergence pattern that you picked up on later in life.
Yeah. So yes. So yeah. And so this is I feel like getting to the part where opposite quote unquote symptom, like diagnosis. So none of us have been officially diagnosed yet. I am pursuing diagnosis this year, but basically, what is it called? Or by officially, I also mean just clinically like diagnosed,
formal psychiatric diagnosis.
Yeah, I was like, self-diagnosed. This is valid. Anyway, I realized that some members of my family and I we probably all have autism. The people that I'm thinking about and me, we all have autism. But our symptoms are really opposite because for the people that raised me, like they probably have alexithymia where they feel very disconnected with feelings. And so it doesn't make sense. It's hard to interpret, et cetera, et cetera. These tend to be, that's like more of I feel like that's talked about in books more for just typical quote unquote symptoms of autism. I happen to have the opposite set where I'm like super sensitive to them, like feelings. And apparently in the book Unmasking Autism, apparently that's also a thing. So
really,
you have one diagnostic category. Let's just play with autism here, where you can be like totally disconnected from feelings or totally way too connected. And so, but how does that make sense?
You can be way too connected with your feelings or way unconnected with your feelings. That's so interesting.
Yeah, because again, this is from the book. What I love about what Dr. Price said is that for some, autism especially is defined, or it's better talked about as the brain having a more bottom-up processing process versus the top-down one. So it's bottom-up data integration. So that's the core piece of what defines autism. So if it's that, it can look like a whole bunch of stuff. It could look like you know your feelings or you don't know your feelings or this and that, the other thing. But right now we're diagnosing through symptoms.
Interesting. So it's almost like a way, so this book is referring to how your environment can definitely play a role in your understanding of emotion and your understanding of feelings and your relationship to it. And so it sounds like it's almost getting away from the medical model of thinking and going towards the therapeutic modality, which is let the client tell their own story, let the client define their own experience, help them gain a unique or subjective understanding of where they're coming from.
Yeah, because especially for neurodivergence, I think just clinically, we're not great at diagnosing. As in we have tests and we have assessments, great, but I don't think they're nearly comprehensive enough. Because what is that for people that, especially people with marginalized identities, or backing up, these tests were designed to diagnose, in my own words, young white boys, which is great. I would prefer some tool versus no tool.
Yeah.
But that same tool is not going to be able to pick up on, it's not going to be able to diagnose people who don't belong in these categories as well. So, for example, a lot of like BIPOC women or just BIPOC people have a harder time with diagnosis because their symptoms don't look like what we have in like the DSM or on paper, whatever. And yeah, the more I feel like marginalized identities you hold, the harder it is to diagnose you.
That's so true, because I think that you have to now attend specific trainings to get a sense of what your diagnosis is. But I think that oftentimes as a therapist who is serving Asian Americans, I have to dig deep into learning other modalities of therapy, because the CBT model is not always effective and the DBT model is not always effective. And so it's almost like you have to create your own sauce to understand one client and to be effective with one client. And it's a completely different story with another client. One client might be wanting just regular CBT. I just want to think about it better. Help me understand this. And so you have to teach them body awareness and emotional integration and all of these different things. And I want to go into your story, Jennie, because I think that we went into a really cool tangent on neurodivergence.
Yeah,
but
I don't even know if I answered the question that
you did. You did answer my question. I love it. I love it. Where, like, one of the things that you said was, I was never really allowed to feel my feelings because I was taught not to feel my feelings. And you talked about like getting your nonverbal cues logged during your somatic experiencing training. And so, like, how did you start your healing journey? And tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So in 2018, well, it started way before. So by that time, I had been in talk therapy for like on and off for about 10 years. And it was super helpful. Yeah, that's why like I don't knock CBT based therapy, but it's just like, if it stops working for you, try other things. But yeah, so basically it was super helpful until it started to get less helpful and I felt stuck because I was like, I felt like I was doing all the things that I was being guided to do, but why was I still anxious? And one of the questions I had a hard time answering before I even got to 2018 was, I'm finding myself, I have all these tools to manage anxiety, which was a big problem at the time. For when I realize I have anxiety, my problem is, what do I do in the 2 hours, 2 weeks, 2 months where I don't know I have it, but I'm still feeling the symptoms? So I'm just, it's because it feels like I'm not anxious. And then I blink for some like period of time. And then I like wake up and I'm like, oh my God, this is awful. Like, how did I get here? So CBT didn't help me resolve that. And so 2018, I had the worst mental health year of my life. And because just like stuff in my life was happening that contributed to it. And at the end of the year, I was like not in a good place. And basically was just like started to really look into starting getting more support in healing. And this was super serendipitous. So early 2019, I reconnected with a leadership coach I had worked with in the past, whom I loved. But it wasn't like I wasn't really even seeking support. We never met at that point because all the work was remote and in audio. And I was in DC, she was in the Bay. We never met like in person or even on video. So I just wanted to meet her. So basically I'm like meeting her for the first time and I'm like telling her how my life is. And she basically says, hey, have you considered you've experienced trauma? Which I sat there frozen for probably a minute, running all the list of what I knew to be trauma, like war, genocide, starvation in my head, none of which I had experienced. And basically I was like, no, I haven't even been in a car crash. Or are you like a big one? What are you talking about? She was like, actually what trauma is whenever your body feels something that feels disproportionate to the things going on in your life. That's one manifestation. And then upon hearing this, I sat there and was like, oh, that's like my whole life. So long story short, we're still working together. And in the 3 years that, like since I worked with her last, she got trained in neuroplasticity and like nervous system stuff. So by the end of 2019, she introduced me to all that work. It also happened that September 2019, like around July of 2019. So I met her in April. Around like July, my life like totally turned around. And I was like living the dream basically until September, where I was dating someone that I felt really close to at the time, and that relationship very suddenly ended. So when that happened in September, it plummeted me into a whole pool of nervous system dysregulation symptoms. So at that point of the year, so we had been working together since I met her or reconnected in April. So by September, she basically was like, hey, let's do some nervous system like regulation work more deeply. Would you be up for that? And I said yes. And the rest is like history. But basically from September to, I would say, honestly, just from September to December, she also said I happened to take to the work really quickly. And in retrospect, that makes more sense based on some of just like my sensory stuff going on. But basically, even with 3 months of the work, I was like, what did you do if I physically feel different? And a lot of the work was basically helping me. Well, the first step was her guiding me through release work, which at the time I had. So you were talking about disconnecting from feelings. Basically, I numbed myself for about 10 years. I cried. I remember crying a lot as a kid and feeling things. But then basically by the time I think from like late high school, maybe till a few years out from grad school, I stopped. I thought crying was pointless and just stopped doing it. Just pushed it down, ignored it, or did something else to distract myself until 2018. I had nowhere else to go. And it all just hit me. But at that time, I didn't have capacity to process it all. So in 2019, she helped give me mechanisms and support, helped me set up safer way to process. And I basically cried for 3 months straight. And we made these, part of the regulation practice that we designed for me was like basically put on my calendar half an hour to a couple hours of time, 3 times a week or whatever it was. And like set up safe things on the ends of like what I call now like bookending these experiences or these sessions in like safety. And as I'm going, like at the start of the time, like the release time, I'll interact with something mildly triggering or just like anything that gets me to feel anything. But then don't stop myself from feeling and just feel it all the way out until completion.
What does that look like to feel it all the way out?
Yeah, so that's a whole, like in now looking back on it, I know what we did was essentially a form of what's called completing the stress response, like survival stress response, which like the long short of it is like our body has a natural our mammals have natural mechanisms to discharge stress. The problem is human beings are the only ones that's conditioned out of doing that. So yeah. Yeah, it's a crazy thing. Like it made sense to me when I learned it, but I was also like, I'm explaining it in a really deeply conceptual way, but to me it's made a lot of intuitive sense. Yeah, so for what that looked like so you asked about what baseline feels like. So if you've ever, for example, crying is a form of release or stress discharge. So if you've ever had a cry where you didn't stop yourself from crying and you ended up just feeling like you're done, like you're not in a particular, so baseline feels like you're probably through this cycle, but you don't feel super empty and you feel some semblance of calm, grounded, nourished. That's the difference between a regulated cry or a safe, resourced cry versus a unsupported, dysregulated. Because if there are also cries that I've had where even during that time where I was like, oh yeah, so this is actually a question I brought to the coach at the time. I was like, I'm having two types of cries. One where I end up feeling pretty decent afterwards. The other, I feel like I'm in like an endless abyss. Am I doing that one right? Like, why?
Wow.
And she was basically, and when she heard that, she said, she told me to basically get acupuncture in 2 days, within the next 2 days. And that also completely changed the game for me because turns out that kind of cry was unsupported. And my system didn't actually have capacity for that type of release. And so after she helped give me more ways to support, especially on like the systems level, like just going straight to the body, because acupuncture, you just help your nerves basically. Then it did feel a lot better. And I had way more. I think almost 100% of my cries were like supported because I knew that, okay, well, if I ever feel like I'm getting into a deep dread, I could get out of it somehow. Like I could just reorient or whatever, because that wasn't going to end up in a good place anyway.
So good. You really started to get in tune with your body and you started to understand like, and I still can't escape from what you just said of humans are the only mammals that are conditioned out of their stress response. And so just the simple example that you gave of being able to let yourself cry all the way is something that I've experienced in my life where I remember my grandpa died and when I was like 4 and someone told me, just stop crying. It's done. He's dead. Just
also
stop.
Broadly speaking, but especially in Asian communities, we're not comfortable with feelings but so much of what stress discharge or regulation healing is to like safely connect with feelings and like basically release and integrate it.
That's so good, Jennie. That's so good. So, okay. One of the things I wanted to ask you is delving into feelings and understanding feelings when it comes to our relationships objectively is important, but can you unpack the benefits of getting in tune with your body, of feeling your feelings all the way? What benefit does that have on the average human?
Yeah, so I would say so the first part being, or the part of that question that's what's the benefit of feeling our feelings all the way? So I think of that as learning how to complete stress responses. So learning what your body naturally needs in the moment, which a lot of folks, I think in the somatic world, talk about that as a sense of following the impulse. It's a bit nuanced than that because you want to make sure you're resourced. But yeah, like following the impulse until you get to baseline is the broad framework. So if you learn to do that process and learn what it feels like for you, you end up relearning how to discharge stress so it doesn't get stuck in your system. And over time, that helps you regulate and the longer term mental health symptoms will start to get better, especially if it's a symptom of just like too much, not enough emotional upkeep.
So does that create a release in the body? Does that create a sense of safety within yourself?
Yeah.
What do you see with your clients and with you?
Yeah. So to the other part of the question, which is what is the benefit of learning attunement in general? So one is that it helps you with things like discharging or learning just what so it helps with discharge. But the other part is, generally speaking, if you're able to, because if you have things like alexithymia, it makes it more complicated. But if you're able to tune in with what's happening in the physical sense, in terms of sensations, whatever's coming up, you can start to learn how to interpret what things mean, or at least get curious about it, so that you could allow yourself to feel it more. And so the way I describe my coaching, and it's not by any means a linear process, but the rough arc I think of it as having is the first thing we work on is being able to tune in, just like hearing what your body's saying. And this could look like a number of ways, but a lot of it is just like tracking, which is we don't ever have to make sense of what's going on, but it's important that we at least log it. So for example, I work with clients to be like, what does any part of your body feel like right now? Just start describing it. Is there a color? Is there a texture? Okay, there's a shape here. Is there an edge? What does that edge look like? All kinds of what can feel like very abstract questions. But the point is to get you to tune in. So step one is learning how to hear these things that are going on that you might not have heard before. Step two is learning to interpret them a bit more, which is, okay, well, now you hear it. Now, okay, well, right now there's a block in my chest. I don't like it. It's very uncomfortable. We go into, oh, does that mean anything? Sometimes it doesn't. And then, so once you start to hear it more, patterns will likely emerge. For example, like when let's say so I'll just use myself as an example. Something that was huge for me when I was working with that coach is that in practicing attunement, she basically taught me to realize that there were like before, you know how I described before as like my experience with anxiety as not being anxious and then blinking and then I'm super anxious and the blink can last like anywhere from minutes to like months.
Yeah.
It turns out that in that blink, there's a whole ramp up of symptoms or like sensations. So I would be able to basically slow down the reaction time more. So when I am more tuned. So for example, it's not just like it's never, I'm not anxious and then suddenly I am. There's like a infinity of smaller sensations that ramp up. So I learned to basically hear the finer notes of this little progression. And it helped a lot. I'm like still anxious or I still experience anxiety and stuff, but I can catch it better.
That's so good. It's in between my blinks or in between one reaction and another, there was a very soft, fluid flood of experiences that you weren't attuned to because you learned not to be attuned with your body.
Totally.
And even when you talked about shapes, I was like, that is such a soft and like kind way to check in with your body. Like, what color do I feel right now? I actually, when you started saying that, if I can bring myself into the space, like I started to picture a hexagon and I was like, oh, that's a lot of edges in the hexagon. What does that mean for me? And then I was like, maybe I'm stressed about different things, or I also feel really purple of maybe I'm like going through a lot of different emotions in my body right now. Oh, that's such a great way to check in with yourself whenever you feel confused. It's like a great way to explore that. Like you're the artist trying to uncover your own experiences.
Yeah. And like sometimes it means the world, like a world of things. Sometimes it means absolutely nothing. But if you're not hearing yourself, you don't know how. You can't like engage in this process at all. You can't get the meaning if that exists.
So if you're using me as an example, if they say, oh, I feel like a square or I feel like a hexagon, what might that mean for the person? Or what do you think what question would you then ask after that?
Yeah, I would ask, first thing that came to mind was, are you like say more in general, but then also you mentioned a hexagon. Where is it in your body? Like, where is it in relation to your physical self? Is it like a small thing somewhere on you? Is it like you're inside the shape? We just play around.
Oh yeah. So I'm inside. It's inside my chest, stomach area. It's like taking over this whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So then I would ask, I would start to ask you to basically either keep it in mind or draw it with your hands just so I can get what the shape is.
Yeah, it's right here. Yeah.
Yeah. So are some parts, just out of curiosity, are these to the side inside your body or outside?
Inside.
Okay.
It's all like a hexagon inside. Yeah.
Yeah. If you were to be able to like tune into the hexagon, is it the same all throughout?
Is it the same?
Yeah. Is it, for example, the same color, texture, whatever have you? all
Oh,
throughout.
it's like lighter up in my chest, a little jagged here, and then heavy. It's like hard. It's almost like hard wood or like plywood down here.
Yeah, so I would just play around with that. And the other thing is, so there's a technique in somatic experiencing called pendulation, where it's the sort of idea behind it is when we experience periods of dysregulation, what's happening is our nervous system is basically either stuck on high or low or alternating between high and low, but we're not like in the mid range. So we're just experiencing awful symptoms of in a bunch of ways. So the way to help resolve that is to just like slowly poke at it to what I think of as unsticking the stuckness or loosening it. But what that looks like in practice is introducing different sensations to the nervous system or helping your body like feel something that might just like shifts is what I'm watching for, basically, if I'm working with you. So in this exercise, if you, for example, you were dysregulated or whatever, and I was like going through a pendulation technique with you, what it would look like is, then I'm just making things up. You might not actually feel this way, but let's say there's a hexagon there and it has a few different textures within. But let's say the hexagon is where you feel activation, but it feels a bit different right outside the hexagon. Let's just imagine this area right outside the hexagon looks different. So I would ask you to basically go to the edge of the hexagon where it feels different and start to focus on the area right within the hexagon and then hop over the line to the other side and then alternate a little bit.
Go to different edges.
Yeah, basically so that you're experiencing like two different things and alternating between them, where one thing is more activated and the other thing is less activated.
Oh.
And it could be the edge, it could be all kinds of stuff.
I already feel calm, like naming the shape, like being in tune with my body. While you were exploring the curiosity, I think that one of the realizations I'm having now talking to you, Jennie, is we can get so caught up in what did you experience? Therefore, you must be experiencing this.
Yeah. And that's a narrative thing that like things like CBT or top-down techniques tend to focus on. It has its place in time. It is absolutely effective, but it's not effective all the time.
Yeah. And I think that people come to you because they want to understand more of what is actually going on with them. And I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, like on my it's just basically on my Instagram and TikTok, I say this little blurb, basically talk to me after talk therapy gets less effective. Well, I think that's like a big signifier. It's just in terms of if you're someone that's curious about healing, one of the first things you're going to go to is to go to get a therapist, which that's amazing. And you totally should. And you should even have that if you want to also work with a somatic practitioner like me. But in case you're experiencing diminishing returns, explore other modalities. But I say this only because has more to do with the user pathway into this work or the client experience because I was like, if we live in a world where people were told to explore bottom-up modalities and first, then like that statement would make no sense.
Yeah.
It's just in this world, we're told to explore top-up because that's the field standard.
Yeah. And I think that I'm just making a really interesting analysis and connection here where I think that with the increase of AI, human intelligence the need for human intelligence is still there, but it's diminishing in its return. But human relationship is becoming more of a need. And this idea comes from a really great writer who talks about AI and the revolution of like slow down and human relationship. His name is Mo Gadot. He used to be like a Google executive, but I'm now understanding from a therapist standpoint, you can't be good in relationship if you don't know what's happening in your body. Because because if let's say that you're in a romantic relationship with somebody or like the people that you're dating, they want to know how you're doing and they want to know who you are. But if you can't articulate what you're saying like the person will create, Brene Brown says clear is kind, because we tend to create stories out of things that we don't understand. And so let's say that your partner just rolls their eyes at you or ignores you, but it's actually not to do with you, it's to do with them. You then probably take that detail and you think that you did something wrong. And so it's almost not having a sense of somatic experiencing can affect your relationships and like the world around you.
Hard, 100% agree. Because I think about this in two levels. One of just like general awareness, because if you're practicing attunement like physically, you become pretty aware, or I feel like you like fast track your awareness to your emotions, because it's like the stuff is more abstract. Whereas if you're doing like more narrative arcing, you can miss stuff. Rather, yeah, maybe it's more abstract and perhaps more accurate, like your body more accurately experiences what you're feeling. The other thing I think about is in relationships. So yeah, just to take the whole attunement thing one step further, if a lot of what happens in relation is like survival response, because basically we trigger each other, we send each other into survival. And that's by design. If we didn't have any relationships, human relationships, then, because I think survival responses and triggers are a relational thing mostly. So if we didn't have that, then we would just never have that kind of stress physiology per se, unless it's like we're interacting with existential environmental stuff. But basically, if you don't, attunement is one layer for general knowledge, but understanding what happens understanding your own like survival stress physiology will like change the way that relationships work. Because these are the times where if you learn that, you'll learn how to identify when you are triggered or when that physiology is acting up. Understand whether it's in response to something that happened in the past or the present. And then from there, figure out what your needs are.
That's so good.
It's
Jennie,
insane.
I wish I had more time to talk to you, but because I have to go to another meeting, I have to go. But I just want to acknowledge you for this is the most natural podcast conversation I've ever had. I felt like I just kept asking you things because I was genuinely curious. If you're ever in Los Angeles, I'd love to interview you personally.
I need to meet you. I'd love
to meet you. This was so good. Yeah,
totally.
Let me stop recording really quick. Oh, did you want to say anything before we go?
I don't think so. Yeah, no, this was great.
Yeah, let me